Gen X parents didn't always look cold. Sometimes they looked responsible and strong, practical, impossible to scare. But if you were raised by a Gen X parent, love may have felt like a security system. Be careful on your way. Are you hungry? Call me when you get there. Not soft, not explained, just a constant state of alert. And years later, you may not call it anxiety. You may call it responsibility. But this is why many children of Gen X parents can't fully relax, because they never quite learned how to feel safe. They were raised by a love that knew how to prepare them for danger. But that love could not always teach them what emotional safety meant. By the end of this video, this won't just explain your parent. It may also explain why rest still feels unsafe. This is the psychology of Gen X parents. Not coldness, but survival memory becoming parenting. Gen X did not become emotionally closed off by accident. They were raised in a world that rewarded independence before emotional language. A world that didn't ask, "How does that make you feel?" A world that asked, "Can you handle this?" And most of them could. But handling something and learning from it and healing from it are not the same thing. This is also why our other Gen X video, Why Gen X Can't Ask for Help, 1965 to 1980, matters here. For many Gen Xers, asking for help did not feel like support. It felt like evidence that they had failed to handle life alone. That reflex did not disappear when they had children. It became the backbone of how they loved. To understand Gen X parents, you have to go back to the house they came home to. Born between 1965 and 1980, Gen X grew up while family life was going through major changes. More mothers were working, fathers were often gone for long hours, and many children were alone when they came home. They were called Latchkey kids, children who carried a house key around their neck because there was no one home to open the door. The house was quiet. The ticking clock felt louder than it should have. They heated food, checked the locks, and listened for the sound of a car coming up the driveway. Nobody had to say, "Grow up." The experiences they had to live through in an empty house were already whispering it into their ears. Attachment theory makes one thing clear. A child does not only need love. A child needs a reliable feeling that someone is emotionally available. Many Gen X children had provision, rules, and expectations, but when they needed to reach their parents, they could not always reach them. So independence stopped being a situation. It became an identity. I figured it out. You can too, but it wasn't just empty houses. Gen X grew up during the time when divorce became the new normal in the 1970s and 80s. There were two homes, two moods, two versions of the truth. Sometimes they became the messenger. Sometimes they became the quiet one. Sometimes they became the one who observed which parent was falling apart before anyone said a word. Family systems theory has a name for part of this: parentification. This is when a child begins to carry emotional weight that belongs to the adult. Sometimes this does not look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like a child who needs nothing because everyone else already needs too much. This teaches a child something dangerous. Love is often real, but stability is not guaranteed. So when Gen X became parents, they did not enter family life as people who had no idea about it. They came with a nervous system trained to scan the room. There is one more layer. Gen X was raised by boomers, and many boomers were raised by people who survived scarcity, pressure, and silence by doing one thing very well: not talking about it. Vulnerability was not modeled. You worked hard. You didn't complain. You kept going. That silence was passed down. Boomers, of course, may have loved their children deeply, but many of them did not give Gen X an emotional vocabulary. So Gen X learned the language that was available: logistics, work, jokes, silence, competence. They could fix a tire, pay the bill, drive across town in the middle of the night. They were very strong when it came to survival. But sitting across from a crying child and saying, "I understand why that hurt you," that language was often missing. When Gen X became parents, this history often split into two reactions. The first was overprotection. "I was left alone too early. My child will never feel that." These are the Gen X parents who showed up to everything, tracked every movement, managed every problem, filled silence with plans. They loved very strongly, but sometimes love looked like control. They were not only watching over you, they were trying to calm the child inside themselves, who once had no one protecting them. The second reaction was forced toughness. "I survived it. You will too." These are the Gen X parents who said, "Figure it out yourself," when you cried, who called fear being dramatic, who thought the best gift they could give you was resilience. In their minds, this was not actually cruel. It was love, translated through the only framework they trusted. They loved you by preparing you for pain, not by teaching you how to feel safe. The hard part is this. Gen X parents often truly loved their children, but some of them could not translate love into emotional safety. They knew protection. They knew provision. They knew pressure. What many of them never learned was how to make their presence felt. The kind of presence where a parent sits next to you in the dark and says, "I know, me too." So their children grew up with love, but they all turned into anxious individuals. They were capable, but rarely at peace. Strong, but always waiting for the next problem to appear. Now that child is grown. The room is quiet. Nothing is wrong. But their shoulders are still tense, because calm still feels like the moment right before something bad happens. Not because they were weak, because their bodies were trained to see calm as temporary and to always be ready for something negative. Maybe Gen X did not raise fragile children. Maybe they raised children who became tired from always being prepared for something bad. Children who learned to observe their surroundings before they could name their own feelings. Children who learned to act okay before they knew how to be okay. Children who still feel guilty while resting, because rest can feel like lowering their guard. And if that is you, one thing may be worth knowing. What was built inside you was not a flaw. It was a survival system handed down to you. They didn't know how to give you peace, because nobody gave it to them first.